everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our June Coffee with the Curator. My name is Andrew Phillips, and I'm the curator, and there's the coffee. It's been a pleasure doing these over the year. We do these once a month, always on a Thursday morning. We bring a few things out from the collection, so we get a chance to tell some stories and show some things that are not usually on display. And this year, and this month especially, we're going to be talking about some people who spent time in France, in Europe during World War I, and which you can see, learn quite a bit more of, over in our temporary gallery. We have an exhibit titled Soldier Stories. All of these, both of these people, as well as the other two in the exhibit, have living descendants in the Stanton area. And I'm going to be very careful where I'm looking during this program, because some of those descendants are in the audience of these two, as well as someone else actually. And I don't want them to be made face stabbing when I get stuff wrong, which I'm sure I will do. But at the end, when we get to questions, I may be calling on them to perhaps give a few more details than I may have. But today we're going to be talking about the two people right here, Margaret Cline and Oscar Wofford Dabney. Incredible people in their own rights. They both traveled to France during World War I. Oscar is in the Army as a truck driver. Margaret serves as a nurse, also for the Army Nurse Corps. The interesting thing about them, one more interesting thing about them, I should say, they return to Staunton and get married. And so the descendants of one are the descendants of the other. So we're going to be learning a little bit about them today. Now, you will note that if you've been here to one of these before, I'm not wearing gloves. Usually I do, but because most of the artifacts that I'm going to be showing you today are documents, are paper, it's a bit better to have nice clean hands, as I've just washed mine, to be sure that I am treating the paper very delicately, where I am making sure I'm not having the cotton gloves on can sort of dull sensitivity, and you don't want to accidentally rip something while you're trying to talk about it. So the two people, again, as I said, Margaret Cline, Oscar Wofford Dabney. Oscar is born in Staunton. Margaret is actually born in North Carolina and moves to Staunton as a teenager. As you can tell by her outfit, she was a nurse. She and a number of her friends attended a nursing school in Philadelphia, and when the war broke out, they joined the Army Nurse Corps and traveled over to France. They spent most of their time at what was called, at a hospital. Actually, let's start with this one. I'm going to spell it first so that when I horribly mangle the French, you won't be able to tell. Montgazon, Montgazon, I don't know. But it had been a monastery and a school before the war forced needs to go in other directions. This one you can also see, if you look closely at the people assembled in the courtyard there. That is a band. They are getting ready to perform. And this is the monastery and school where she was serving as a nurse. This was, of course, a very busy time. And the city is Angers, A-N-G-E-R. It was behind the front lines. She was never really in danger of artillery or the Germans in general. But they wanted to make sure that they were close. They were close to the actual wounded soldiers. The wounded soldiers, and there were quite a few of them. This was a truly terrible war. But because of modern medicine, many survived that otherwise would not have. And these are images. The one in my left hand is of the soldiers being unloaded from a train. You can see them coming off in their on stretchers. The other is of a hallway in the college where they were preparing to send the soldiers to their appropriate wards. They were mostly dealing with American and French soldiers, just based upon where they were physically. They were making sure that as much that health could be restored, and because it was a little behind the lines, it was also a place where the soldiers had the opportunity, the ability to recuperate, not close to the artillery fire. before the video. One of the wards that Margaret spent quite a bit of time in was actually a gas ward. She was there working with an English doctor, trying to help the soldiers who had been exposed to mustard gas. It was a terrible form of warfare, certainly, one in which any exposed skin, as well as the lungs from the inside, felt like they were burning. And Margaret, and I have some little cheat sheets to make sure I'm getting things right, but Margaret writes even about, or later speaks of the horrific smells in that ward because of the way the gas particles ate at the skin and really burned the lungs from the inside out. She receives her honorable separation. She's honorably discharged from the U.S. Army in on June 2nd of 1919, so she is spending quite a bit of time in France even after the fighting ends in November of 1918. This was not uncommon. There are still, the armistice is declared, everyone's wounds did not suddenly get healed, and so Margaret spent many more months over in France before returning to the United States in June. She goes on as a nurse. She continues to work as a nurse for the rest of her career. And at one point, a little after she gets back, just about a year after she gets back from France, she gets married to the gentleman over here, Oscar Wofford Dabney. And he and his brother Eugene Dabney, who is interesting for Staunton as well, because he was actually the fire chief for Staunton for a number of years in the 40s, 50s, and I believe into the 60s. But they are some of the last men from Staunton to be drafted into the U.S. Army. They board a train in Staunton in early May and travel to Fort Thomas in Kentucky. They get a little bit of a training, then they both head to Camp Wadsworth down in South Carolina, where they get much, much more training. And the thing that is the best about Oscar is that he kept a diary. I think it's best sometimes to read their own words. And in a very human reaction to what is going on, he starts to go a little stir-crazy while he is in these camps and doing the same thing day after day after day. Often in his diary he will write out, "I did the same thing today." At one point he even apologizes to his diary for having to write that he did the exact same thing. But on June 8th, 1918, so he's been in training for about a month, he's currently in South Carolina, he writes, "Reveille, drill, and retreat we did today, and we are getting very neat, I am glad to say. Ha ha ha, the Army is making a poet out of me." I'm sure it was that, and not that he was just going a little stir-crazy. This talent of his for resorting to poetry when he's incredibly bored comes back when he is in France. Here we are. On October 9th of 1918, he writes, "Now tonight I take up my pen and write the same thing over again. On 3 and off 9, and guess I'll do this till the end of time." Interestingly, on that date, he doesn't go ha ha at the end. It seems like he's getting a bit tired of it as well. But it's totally understandable why he would be getting so bored. This is a postcard of his from Camp Wadsworth. It's in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And this is of men, it's been colorized, of men digging trenches. They are doing this over and over and over again, making sure that when they arrive in France, should they need to, they can do it quickly and under fire. Both he and Eugene are here in South Carolina, but they are separated when Oscar is tapped to be a wagoner or truck driver for the Army. Digging the trenches. This separates him from his brother, who remains, they were with the 54th Infantry Regiment, part of the regular U.S. Army. Eugene remains with that army unit, and is a frontline soldier. And because of the nature of the military, you don't know where everybody else is, even if they are your brother. And so at one point he writes that he goes to see Eugene and he's gone. He just doesn't know where he's come. Luckily for him, they do reunite in the end of the war. Oscar is over as a truck driver. He is traveling up and down the Western Front, primarily in the Verdun region. This is one of the hardest, well, that's not really fair. It was all incredibly hard fought over along the Western Front. Here it is. But on October 29th, he is not too far from the city of Verdun, and he says, "We are sure getting up where the fun has been. We have been passing through blown-up villages all day. They are nothing but just a pile of rock. This kind of war sure does wreck things." An understatement, to be sure. But he spends his time as a truck driver making sure to deliver supplies. Part of it, though, is also his time when he first arrives in France in July of 1918. He is not immediately given a truck. He is sent to the city of Ornans, which is not too far from the Swiss border, actually, a little bit north of Geneva, so he's in a much safer zone. He is well behind the lines, and so he and a number of the other men in his unit are primarily given military police duties. One of the things, though, he starts to note on September 5th of 1918, "This country is sure the dirtiest place I was ever in. There is a manure pile every place, and the people don't seem at home without one on their front door." Not especially understanding, perhaps, but even just a few days earlier, on what was Labor Day in the United States, September 1st, he said, "If it had not been Sunday, we would have labored on Labor Day, but I don't suppose they know what Labor Day is over here." And his time in France and the way he writes about it is very interesting. This is not someone who had done extensive travel, certainly international travel before. And he writes, here it is, he writes every once in a while, once they get over to France, the U.S. Army starts paying them in French currency, so they're able to buy things in town. And he writes even, and he has because of this, he sort of gets an idea of exchange rates, odd as it is. He has the same pay while he's in the Army, but because of the differences between the U.S. dollar and the French franc, that fluctuates a little bit. And he starts to notice at the very end of the war, on October 1st, here he says, "Well, payday came again and I received more money, or rather more cigarette coupons, because he sees these little colorful French bills as more akin to the coupons he receives at home. I drew 101 francs and 50 cents. French money is going up, so the Germans must be going down and running." In October of 1918, that was not an incorrect statement. He was getting very close to that mark. And it is not really until October that he is actually given the truck and performs the duties that he had originally been assigned over in the United States. And at the end of the war, he even writes on November 11th that he has been traveling through the night. He has a truck that has poor headlights in general, but because of the concern about German attacks, they are told not to have headlights on at all. At one point he writes that I'm just as worried about being hit by a German if the lights are on as I am about running into a tree and breaking my neck if the lights are off. Understandable, certainly. But on November 11th of 1918, he writes, "It sure can't be true, though everyone here is celebrating. I arrived here at Grand-Père this evening, and they say the war is over. If it is true, I bet it is some celebrating going on at home. Let us hope it is over. I have unloaded and awaiting orders." He says the next day, on November 12th, "Joined a convoy going back to Verdun, 248 trucks in a line. Everything, infantry, artillery, and all, are going back, so the war must be over." Like his future wife, he does not get to return to the United States right away. Oh, that was something I wanted to mention before I go. He does see his brother again, before I end the war entirely. He does see Eugene again. He is driving his truck, and he notices the regiment that his brother is in, and he stops to take a look, and he gets a chance to see Eugene as well as another old friend from Stanton marching by. They are headed off to the trenches, and this is at the end of October. On November 10th, the day before the war ends, I saw Eugene last night. Glory be, he is going back out of this hell. And as he is well, I guess he will make it all right. Gave him and Dick Bennett all my tobacco and cigarettes. So he's very generous to his brother, certainly. But he does not get he, like his future wife, does not immediately return to the United States. One of the things that he spent quite a bit of time actually transporting American soldiers to positions further behind what had been the line, taking up positions that had been held by the Germans since 1914. And at one point, he is even tasked, let me make sure I can find it. This is, of course, the one that I did not put a little note by. And if oh, here we are. We are taking 16 Russians on each truck back with us. It seems they are that they were eating dead horses and grass and anything they could get when we got here. He then writes how it's a shame that he's having to haul these men and not Americans. But this is just one more piece of what is going on as the war comes to an end and everything suddenly stops. These were prisoners. These were Russian prisoners who were not treated especially well by the Germans, as they will not be in World War II either. And they are reduced to truly terrible conditions. And one of the things that these trucks are doing after they've transported things behind the lines, they are picking up these Russian prisoners and bringing them back into a more developed, or I should say less destroyed, part of France so that they can begin getting some help. He will stay in France. I keep looking in the wrong direction. He will stay in France also until the summer of 1919. He and his future wife will actually return to the United States within about a month of each other. In 1920, the two will get married, and one of the great things we also have from him is this. This is a souvenir of his that he bought in France. It says, to my dear mother. And this was a pretty common sort of souvenir. On the back is an actual postcard that he wrote to her in Winchester. It's embroidered with very lovely thread, and this was a very popular sort of form of souvenir. It was more than just a postcard. It was something that was tangible and three-dimensional to a degree that you could send back to home. And we have, once I make sure everybody has seen, we also have a number of these in our collection that are from a wide variety of sources. It was a popular form of souvenir, and these are a number of these were not a part of the Dabney collection, but these are all from American servicemen. These are mostly flags. Some of them, the ones with a lot of detail, they don't really lend themselves to the embroidery. The double-headed eagle on the Russian flag especially gets sort of turned into a black star a number of times. And I will have all of these things, as well as a number of other photos, up at the front afterward, if anyone is interested in taking a closer look after beyond my brief stint as Van White.
I noticed that the To My Mother was not written in French.
It was not. They were intended to be for Americans. It was meant to be a souvenir for American troops. And when Oscar especially gets back, one of my favorite things of this collection, and I want to be very careful with it, he has a map of France. And again, this will be up here so that you can take a closer look. This is a map of France where he has mapped out his whole course. You can see you have the arrow beginning up in England, and he is headed down to France. He marks the sort of path of the ferry. He then he tracks the train trip that they took around Paris. And you know what? I'm going to do it this way. That way I don't have to try to turn around since it's so large. This side we'll see it in just a moment. But this is a really remarkable piece. I mean, this is not the sort of thing that the Army wants their soldiers to be doing. In fact, at one point, I'll do this. At one point, it is noticed that he has been keeping a diary, and he is reprimanded because the military, if something should happen, and that diary where he's giving all these actual details and timetables and everything had fallen into enemy hands, that could be some pretty useful intelligence. Luckily for him and for us, that did not happen, and he maintained his diary without getting captured or getting taken away from him. But it is still a very critical piece of history. And so Margaret and Oscar both returned to the United States. They are married in 1920. And in 1925, they both received checks from the U.S. government as part of the War Benefit Compensation Act, the World War Benefit Compensation Act, I believe. And it is meant to give a little extra money after sort of being forced by Congress to do so, I suppose. But both Oscar and Margaret, this is the letter that Oscar receives. He received $1,113 from the government. Nice chunk of change. And he and Margaret, they both received checks, and they combined their money, and they built a house up on North Madison Street here in Stanton, and that is where they would live and raise their family. Oscar would go on to be an electrician. He would work in Virginia and West Virginia and Kentucky. And Margaret, as I said, stayed as a nurse.
Did they know each other before the war?
That is a good question for the descendants. But I will end by saying that they knew each other for quite a long time after the war. They were married for 53 years until he passed away in 1973.
So which houses?
That's a question for Deb. And this is them, obviously, a little bit later than in the photos behind me. But they had 2 children, I believe, and 6 grandchildren. And you've seen this, I'm sure. But they are fascinating people in their own right, and really help to illustrate how an incredible amount of history can be found both in our own family trees and perhaps in the house just up the block. It's a really interesting and inspiring tale. It's great that they both come back healthy, certainly, but an incredible achievement on its own. But this has been a very brief and World War I focused story about Margaret and Oscar. I'm happy to answer any questions, and we'll probably be calling on family for ones that I don't know. But thank you so much for coming. Yes, ma'am?
That map of France, did he do that after he got back? Or did he do it?
Yeah, he did it after he got back.
I noticed
it's all in the same
map was
handwriting,
printed in English as well.
Right,
So.
the area around Verdun, he even just sort of does this big circle, because he's not really sure of his path, and he just underlines and circles the towns that he knows he went to, as opposed to being able to track. He even writes at one point about getting, or he and some others getting sort of lost, separated from the rest of them, and having to bump through back roads to try to get to the town they were trying to make it to.
I can imagine it was rather destroyed and
Just a bit. I mean, there were the roads were one area that were especially targeted by artillery, so they are certainly not in great condition. This is also the 19-teens, so roads weren't what we think of them now anyway. So, and nor were trucks what we think of today either. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
At the hospital, did they have, as far as they were Americans but also British, they served all the soldiers, or were the?
It was an Allied hospital.
Okay.
There were certainly, it was in a French city, obviously. I mean, most of it was, except for the Belgian ones. And they would take any Allied soldiers that came to them. In the gas ward, she was working primarily with an English doctor. But just based on where it was in the line, there weren't a lot of British soldiers in that area. So it was primarily Americans.
So they even wounded German soldiers?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that. That would, It would depend on the severity. Certainly, I mean, that is something that did happen back then, though they didn't get a bed next to the French guy. You know, it was they were hospitals in what were essentially prison camps for most of them. So it's possible that there could have been Germans, but I don't know that for sure.
Is there,
Oh.
excuse me, are there
Yes.
records of men who were in World War I that you can find out about where somebody was located or what hospital they might have?
There are, excuse me, there are. Unfortunately, unlike with World War II and really the Civil War, there were a lot of those records were stored at an archive, National Archives facility in Kansas City, where there was a fire. And so a lot of World War I paper records were actually lost. So the World War I records are more spotty, than even the Civil War, even though it was longer ago. So there are some out there. Again, unlike the Civil War, where there's the National Park has the great soldier-sailor database, where you can pretty much put in any name and see where they were and where their unit was. World War I does not have a database like that. So there are some out there, but it's a bit spotty, unfortunately.
Do you know where she did her nursing in her later life?
She was, I can give she was a private duty nurse in Stanton, Winchester, and Charleston, West Virginia. And the school was Camp Hill, Chestnut Hill Hospital School for Nurses that was up in Philadelphia.
So how old were they at the point that they left?
He is born in 1893, so he is in his mid-20s. And you know what? I'm not.
She was a year older.
She was a year older. Okay, so they were both. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming. I have, like I said, I have a number of other photos. If you'd like to take a closer look at the postcards or the map or any of that, I have that all up here. Thank you for coming. And next month, I should say, in July, we will be talking about Woodrow Wilson and golf. So I'm really going to push up on golf in the next month. Thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest.